Welcome to News from Neptune for the 46th week of 2018. I'm Carl Estabrook. Our program is conceived in the spirit of Rosa Luxemburg, murdered by a social democratic government a century ago, who said, "The most revolutionary thing one can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening." That begins by calling things by the right name, particularly in regard to socialism and capitalism. Our mentor Noam Chomsky says, quote, "Terms like capitalism and socialism have been so evacuated of meaning that I don't like to use them. There's nothing remotely like capitalism in existence. To the extent there ever was, it disappeared in the 1920s. Every industrial society is one form or another of state capitalism." That doesn't deny that state capitalist regimes that call themselves socialist made immense strides in the 20th century, in Russia and China notably. Since the last decade of that century, our program has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media, done in the spirit of Noam Chomsky. First on a so-called community radio station, and now via Urbana Public TV and YouTube. Earlier editions of our program are available at archive.org. Chomsky says in the U.S. media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. David Green and I will try to say some true things on a What Else Is New edition of News from Neptune, on the designed uselessness of the midterm elections and the news mainstream media ignored because of them. I have several that I want to mention, a brief list that I want to, a long list of brief notes that I want to mention that we owe to our researcher who's outdone himself this week, Dr. No J.B. Nicholson. He begins by recommending a two-part video series on contact with Chris Hedges. Hedges talks to Professor David Harvey, who wrote the early book, A Brief History of let's try that again. Harvey is the author of A Brief History of Neoliberalism, a crucial book, and the interview is about criticism of neoliberalism. Most Americans don't even know the term, I think, and we should, because it describes the society that we're living in the midst of. Point two.
Let me just add that
Sure.
only part one of those two parts is up so far on RT, but I assume the second part will be up within a few days.
We'll perhaps, I think what we will do is broadcast both parts of that crucial interview in place of this program next week, the day after Thanksgiving,
That would work well.
if we can get our technical people
Our crack technical people.
I thought they'd given up crack. In any case, that's a plan for the next edition of News from Neptune. Point two, protesters have no time for objecting to war. I'm astonished there was a protest over the firing of Jeff Sessions, the Attorney General, by Trump, part of the Trump derangement syndrome. Point three, defense contractors still see a boom time under the Democratic control of the House of Representatives. We've argued before the election about whether the Democrats should be given control of the House of Representatives. I was strongly opposed to that and even came to voting for our feckless Republican incumbent in this district, in this congressional district, and what the Democrats have in mind in terms of their pandering to the war contractors, the defense contractors, is borne out since the election. Number four, the inadvertently published Pentagon documents expose the U.S. hand in Yemen, that the U.S. is responsible for the mass murder in Yemen and starvation, is hardly a mystery to anyone who's been paying attention to something other than mainstream media. But now we have, as I say, inadvertently revealed an account of how that's so from the U.S. government itself. Point five, an Israel ceasefire in Gaza, which is not the splendid move for peace that it appears, but an example of the wretchedness of Israeli politics, and we'll have a word about that. Number six, on the environment, Monsanto influenced the Canadian government to approve glyphosate. I knew I was going to get there, Ron. Glyphosate, I guess that's close enough.
I think so.
A couple of years ago, with studies written by Monsanto, now owned by Bayer, that is, international corporations doing the environmentalist work for them by informing the Canadian government that, of course, this stuff is safe and we needn't worry about it. Point seven, Russiagate. House Democrats will launch 85 investigations. No, I'm not making this up. 85 investigations of President Trump, including Russian collusion, of course, in the election, and demanding his tax returns, none of which will address why he was elected, the accelerating economic inequality in the U.S., which produced this particular populist upsurge, as it is indeed doing elsewhere. Number eight, identity politics is alive and well in media, including self-identified alternative news media. We have a sad example from the otherwise insightful Laura Flanders and Democracy Now! Number nine, Democracy Now! Reaffirms its commitment to Trump derangement syndrome and impeaching Trump, with no analysis of what that means. Should this be a step on the road toward getting Trump out of office before the end of his term? He's fallen in other words, with the absolutely fantastic Democratic Party, war party, misaccount, false account of what's going on in American politics. This is astonishing. Next, good voting policy isn't designed to and won't change social and economic policy. All this exhortation to go vote and the great concern about whether or not there are irregularities in the voting process on all sides ignore the fact that our voting setup is designed precisely not to make any changes in the form of rulership that the United States undergoes, and indeed is successful in doing that, making sure your vote doesn't make any difference. War funding. Millions of U.S. taxpayer money in Syria is being funneled to, guess who? Al-Qaeda, our good friends. You remember 9/11 after all. The money that we've been spending, and it's a lot, the money that we've been spending to kill people in Syria has been funneled through the people who are pretty good at killing people in Syria, not as good as we, but still good. That is Al-Qaeda. We've been giving Al-Qaeda money. And that comes from, once again, nothing less than the Joint Inspector General report on Operation Inherent Resolve. It's too easy to make puns about that. Inherent Resolve is the U.S. war in Syria. Next. The Ebola outbreak in the Democratic Republic of Congo is bound up with American policy, at least to the encouragement of the wars in the Congo that the U.S. AFRICOM, the African Command, has been at the very least ignorant of. Ignorant in inverted commas. The U.S. is supporting this. Another interesting note on Democracy Now's reluctance to critically examine the Democratic Party, newly elected Representative Ocasio-Cortez backs some young climate activists conducting a sit-in in Representative Pelosi's D.C. office, demanding that Democrats back a Green New Deal. Without mentioning the fact they stole the term from the Green Party, we might see once again an example of the false front that the so-called progressive Democrats are putting up. And then finally, exploitation. I've got a personal connection or two with this story. Richard Wolff, the economics professor who has been more acute perhaps, about American capitalism and its decline than anyone else, talks about the peculiar deal that leaves Amazon in charge of two headquarters in New York and in Northern Virginia. And as I say, there's a personal connection with the latter one to me. I grew up in Northern Virginia where the headquarters is going to be, and in fact, the headquarters is going to include land where my father's company was based for many years. I know the area in which I worked as a high school student and so forth, and remember quite vividly. And what they're doing with it is quite remarkable and probably not worth the money it's printed on. Finally, an irony alert, Apple wins an anti-slavery award. And the irony here is the fact that Apple's suppliers in Taiwan have working conditions that approach modern slavery. This has been misrepresented if it was reported at all in the press, because the press talks about Chinese suppliers as if the Apple suppliers are in the People's Republic of China. They're not. They're in Taiwan. And if you've heard, there's some difference between the government of China and Taiwan. So the slavery that's being talked about here that Apple is responsible for, that Apple is taking advantage of, is Taiwanese. Many things here, but one you want to start with, and if I have time for it, I've got another poem from a Taiwanese worker that we're supplied with, once again, by our omnicompetent researcher, Dr. Noam.
It looks like you learned to read Chinese since the last time?
No, I don't. Over the years, I've tried to learn a little Chinese, at least to read a little of Chinese, and I'm very bad at it. Okay. What I happen to have here, and once again, because our researcher supplied it, is the Chinese poem with a interlinear translation. This poem is written by a worker in one of these factories that supplies Apple, and even in translation, it has some power.
Well, I guess I would start by saying that since the election a week ago Tuesday, what with all of the controversies we had, including on this program to a certain extent about voting for Democrat, lesser evilism, and so forth, it seems that after the Democratic Party did manage to take back the House and not the Senate, but not the Senate, there was, I get the feeling there was sort of pent up on the left anyway, on much of the reading I do, there was sort of pent up resentment and increased criticism of the Democratic Party, whatever people's views may have been about the actual voting process. There was this sort of pent up energy regarding how bad the Democrats truly are, which I am fully on board with. The best example locally, I think, was expressed by David Johnson on the World Labor Hour that's heard on Saturday mornings over on WRFU, or that can be listened to online. But there are many other examples of people, when it was all said and done, saying, what was all that about? What is it the Democrats are really going to do? But of course, we're finding out about all this focus on this maintaining the focus on Donald Trump, and,
Exactly,
and not really dealing with it, and that has to do with the nature of the kind of candidates who did help the Democrats take back the House. They're basically DCCC candidates. They're basically military industrial complex candidates, and so it's clear that we can't expect any of the things that so-called progressives have been advocating, and were perhaps hoping that there would be a glimmer of light if the Democrats took back the House, even though it's clear that what can you do when the Republicans still have the Senate, and what can you do for that matter when Donald Trump still has to sign off on these things?
I think the important point, though, David, is the one you started with, that what this does is maintain the focus on Trump, as if Trump were the problem. Trump is not the problem except for the American political establishment, Republican and Democrat, the war party, if you like, who have been afraid of Trump from the beginning, that he will depart from the belligerence, the threats of war against Russia and China, and that's what the whole hysterical Russiagate thing is about. In fact, if we had a serious political discussion in this country, it would become clear that what Trump represents is this threat to the neoliberal and neoconservative policies of all recent administrations, up to and including, notably, the Obama administration. That threat was expressed in the campaign, in the presidential campaign, and that threat indeed garnered votes for Trump. People who had voted for hope and change with Obama in crucial districts across the country voted for Trump precisely because they didn't see the hope and change in the Obama administration. Now, it's difficult sometimes to see this because, of course, Trump in office has proved to be one of the weakest presidents in recent American history, in spite of the bluster. His actual accomplishments in any extent have been few. The ones that have taken place have been interesting, but have only served to increase the fear and hatred of the political establishment that wants to use war to keep Russia and China in their place. And the accomplishment that has frightened the political establishment of the Trump administration is the détente with North Korea. And the political establishment in America, which includes, as I say, not only both parties, but also the so-called intelligence community, CIA and FBI, the Pentagon, the State Department, all of these groups are busily making sure that Trump doesn't fulfill any of these things that he suggested, however tentatively, in the campaign. That's what produces the politics of the last election, where there was no real difference in the policies being put forward by the Republicans and Democrats. They found a few small symbolic issues that they suggested they differed on, but they didn't really. There aren't any real differences there.
Pre-existing condition.
Exactly.
Is sort of archetypal of that, or symbolic of that.
I think that's true.
The triviality of the campaign.
There's a real issue there in American politics, and that issue is for the United States to have a health care system comparable to other civilized countries, to civilized countries. I won't give the U.S. that particular description right now. The sort of what we would see as single-payer health care, Medicare for all, that's the standard arrangement even in much poorer countries like Britain, and for all the Tories can do. But instead of that being the issue, we have these sort of symbolic and fake issues, and the Democrats, who supposedly should be criticizing the Republicans on this matter, aren't.
And just to use the healthcare issue to segue into the post-Veterans Day issue, or to the military issue, just one little thing I thought might be a good way of demonstrating how twisted and hypocritical both our war policies and our healthcare policies are. Ironic in obvious ways, the VA is basically some would present it as a model of single-payer healthcare. It is a model of socialized medicine.
Right.
And of course, the people who are in the military, there's many socialistic aspects, what you could call socialistic aspects of military life. Call it irony if you want, because what the military is really fighting for is capitalism, or whatever Noam Chomsky wants to call it, neoliberal capitalism, financialized capitalism. But the military is, to a certain extent, in its own conduct, excluded from some of the worst aspects of that. The VA is one reason for that. They want to get rid of that. There are people who want to privatize the Veterans Administration services, and there are real divisions within the military groups advocating for veterans, which of course you didn't hear about during the whole nauseating Veterans Day thing that we had to endure last weekend. But still, it's important to note that veterans groups I think the most credible ones, whether they're anti-war or not, and they're not, but are actually genuinely interested in the well-being of veterans, are opposed to this privatization. And this privatization is just a way of there's a kind of creepy privatization that's being put on the table that would end up sort of eating out the heart of the way the VA works. Because like any other insurance system, you need a lot of people in the pool to make it work properly. And this kind of privatized plan would invite some people, especially healthy people, out of the pool. So, and it would cost the government more money to insure them in the private market than to take care of them in the VA as it exists now. Well, that could be there's some articles you can access about that. But just to point out the twisted ironies of how all these issues play out in relation to the military and government spending. But the bottom line is what the military is fighting for is, in a way, to get rid of the kind of systems that might benefit them in this instance.
And it's another example of the way in which the government, both parties, say that, well, of course, a single-payer system or Medicare for all is off the table, even for favored groups, so groups that are supposedly owed such care, like veterans. The government says, well, of course, it would be too expensive to do anything like that, which, in fact, is ridiculous for reasons that we've talked about here before. No one, as the late J.K. Galbraith said, no one turns down a check signed by the U.S. government. And the fact of the matter is that the vast amounts of money that the U.S. has spent on war in this generation would be more than enough to provide the sorts of care that we're talking about for everybody. So it's only when the situation is surrounded by a bodyguard of lies and our politics do not include any real discussion of matters like this that the U.S. government can get away with what it does.
Yeah. But of course, the purpose of Veterans Day is to sanitize war, is to talk about veterans instead of the wars that they have either voluntarily or involuntarily participated in. And that's obvious. The News Gazette lays it on real thick. Our intrepid veterans journalist, voice of the veterans journalist, Paul Wood, advises us this past weekend that World War II veterans in the Pacific Theater, all of the ones he's spoken to, feel that it was necessary to drop the atom bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in order to end the war sooner. And they may well think that, and they're quote-unquote entitled to think that, but of course
it's nonsense.
It's nonsense.
Right.
And Paul Wood uses this, who isn't the brightest bulb on the upcoming Christmas tree, just sort of relays that as kind of evidence that it was the right thing to do, just adding insult to injury in terms of all of this propagandistic coverage of Veterans Day ceremonies and so forth, without a glimmer of truth as to what from World War I to the present time, how we got into these wars, what the results were of these wars, who benefited from these wars while these wars go on, how much they cost, et cetera, Not a word about that. We're here to honor these people and not to talk about war.
This is, you're watching News from Neptune, a What Else is New edition, in the sense that what David just described remains a staple of American propaganda, particularly American propaganda about war. What else is new?
Just sort of one more quick thing, because
Sure.
I did a quick Google of, because I was curious it became so clear to me from watching a little television and a little sports over the last weekend how systematic this Veterans Day coverage is. And I wonder, well, we all know about the PR industry, about its advent during World War I to sell the war, and ever since.
I wish we did know that.
I wish we knew that. And I sort of Googled that. I said, well, what's going on now in the PR industry? So I Googled sort of Veterans Day plus public relations industry, and I got a little blurb here from a media consultant or PR consultant of some kind, advising his colleagues or her colleagues how to handle this, and I think it was a she wrote, certainly Veterans Day is not to be confused with last week's National Cat Day or the upcoming National Square Dance Day, celebrations that beg for this is PR talk, I guess, B2B and B2C PR teams to newsjack them with crazy creative pitches. Veterans Day, by contrast, demands a serious and thoughtful campaign. If you're building a corporate social responsibility program around our nation's observance of that day, it had better strike the right tone. So in case you're getting into the PR business, be careful about Veterans Day. Be sure to strike the right tone.
I fear we may be failing in tone these days, and we need to add more toner, right?
Yeah, right, right.
There's something here that I'm going to indulge myself this week before the holiday in talking about on these war issues. It takes a moment to tell the story, but you realize that garrulous old men like to tell stories, and this one, particularly stories of their youth, and that's exactly what this is.
Well, at least one garrulous old man.
When I was but a lad, I attended a high school in Northern Virginia named for George Washington and Robert Edward Lee. George Washington, of course, was the general of the Continental Army in the American Revolution, and Robert Edward Lee was the general of the Confederacy, or the leading general of the Confederacy during the U.S. Civil War. And the high school was called, not surprisingly, Washington-Lee. You didn't pronounce the hyphen. Washington Lee High School. Well, you know, that was long ago and far away, and the wench is dead, as the poet says. But in fact, the wench is dead. I married her, and she went to the high school too. But once again, another story. The school has recently undergone a local campaign, perhaps bound up with the events in Charlottesville and the question of statues of Confederate generals and so forth, where a group of local citizens wanted to rename the high school and remove the name of Robert Edward Lee, the Confederate general, from the name of the school. Well, that caused a tremendous kerfuffle among people in the area. The school is one of the oldest in the region, and as I say, was central to the probably a better name for the school, to the community in suburban Washington for many years. But there were some of us who pointed out that if you were going to object to Lee as the name of the school, you should object to Washington as well. After all, both men were slaveholders. Both men fought wars that were finally in defense of slavery. And the notion that these should somehow be celebrated, perhaps because of the personal virtues, whatever they were, of the gentleman in question, didn't seem didn't seem accurate, didn't seem defensible to a lot of people in the region. Well, the outcry on the other side was very great, and there has been, as I say, a local kerfuffle on the matter for some time. Friends of mine and I were involved with it, and I ended up writing a couple of letters about it and so forth. But one of the lines that emerged was the reverence for war in the American tradition, and the shock on the part of perfectly ordinary Americans who went to high school even as long ago as I did, at the notion that these people could be criticized in any way. The fact that both Washington and Lee were generals, leaders of a war, they killed people, in other words, in order to protect the institution of slavery, was the point that some people had trouble with. That seemed to be obvious in terms of Lee, but was it true of Washington as well? The short answer is yes. In the immensely propagandized tradition of American history, the history that you were taught in high school, the history that is taught indeed in American college history departments across the country, the notion that the American Revolution was a defense of slavery is not so clear, but a number of recent discussions have made it clear. What happened, very roughly, was that the British government was moving in the 1770s towards the abolition of the slave trade and indeed abolition of slavery in Britain itself. Now, this wasn't necessarily a couple of important court cases make that clear, and the argument is worth working out, as it has been recently in a very good book by Gerald Horne called The Counter-Revolution of 1776. The point was that the British government was moving towards the abolition of slavery, not necessarily for pure motives. What was happening in the British economy in the 1770s was an invasion of that economy by the North American colonies. The settler colonial regimes that Britain had established in North America, which were still technically colonies of Great Britain, colonies of the English Crown, rather, the economic success of those societies was threatening that of Britain itself. Recent study of the cotton business, or of the cotton industry, makes this particularly clear. What British capitalism had accomplished in part by destroying the cotton industry of India was now being destroyed itself by the cotton industry, or by cotton production from North America. So Britain had reasons for curbing American colonial economy, and that colonial economy depended upon slavery as it depended upon primarily cotton. Awareness amongst American elites, both North and South, of what was happening was clear. They saw that Britain was moving toward crippling the American cotton production, the American slave-produced cotton industry, and that was the basis of the fortunes of American elites, both North and South. It was not just a Southern American, North American phenomenon. So the war against Britain, separation from Britain in 1775, was the logical outcome of this economic war that Britain was proposing by abolishing slavery, by abolishing the basis of the American elite's economy. Separation from Britain and the maintenance of the peculiar institution, that is slavery, was paramount for both Northern and Southern American elites. When push came to shove and the fire was opened on the Lexington Green on the morning of 19th of April of 1775, what was at stake was a commercial and indeed imperial fight between the colonists in North America and the British home government. And the issue was slavery. The war broke out in order to protect slavery. So our notions of what Washington was about are similar. Our notions need to be corrected, and we need to understand that what the Revolutionary War was doing was comparable almost a century earlier to what the U.S. Civil War was doing.
And I guess I would add to that the historians in the last 10 or 15 years have researched the issue not just of the slave trade and not just of cotton, but of the breeding of slaves in this country, in that region to which you refer, the northern region of the slave region, not the cotton belt, that you needed to their profits and their wealth depended on the as cold as it sounds, production and exportation of slaves from their region to the southern regions, and then we come to the research of people like Edward Baptist and so forth about what was going on there. So I guess the other thing I would say is that we revise. There was a lot to understand about the history of our wars and the motives for our wars, all of which I think could be understood in a capitalist framework, imperialist framework, colonialist framework. Depending on what you're looking at, the question becomes more of a practical one in terms of when we talk to people to get to try to promote a more accurate idea of who our wars benefit and what they are for. The question becomes sort of a pragmatic one. Do you touch on the hot button issues, for instance, World War II? Do you want to get into an argument about World War II or the Civil War or the Revolutionary War? Or do you want to focus on the more obvious, quote unquote, obvious arguments against wars from moving forward from World War II, especially Vietnam, especially obviously the most recent wars in the Middle East, Iraq, and so forth? And do is it strategically or tactically appropriate or worthwhile to emphasize the entire history? Obviously, some people are going to be open to that, but other people are going to at least understand how destructive these recent wars have been and who benefits from them. That's the only comment I would make in terms of my thinking about how we approach these issues in the anti-war movement.
And if we bring this question back now to the recent political exercise in this country, the midterm elections, it's clear who won that election. For all the micro-analysis that you have heard from mainstream media about the voting patterns and whatnot in this last election, it was clear that the war party won the election. Some people have pointed this out in so many words. I recommend particularly the Black Agenda Report website, where a piece by Danny Haifong says that in so many terms, in so many words. Midterm results, the war party rules. He says, quite rightly, forget the midterms, the blue wave was a low tide. That is the notion that the Democrats were going to sweep all before them. The blue wave was a low tide. The Democrats took the House but lost the Senate, and badly. The good news is that another excessively hyped election is over. Let's talk instead about how under U.S. imperialism, war is a constant. Republicans and Democratic Party officials are members of the war party. U.S. imperial wars rage on regardless of whether a Democrat is elected for president or Congress. The war party follows on the dictates of Wall Street and the war machine. Party membership not only includes Democrat and Republican officials, but also the corporate media. This seems to be quite right. I'll post Mr. Haifong's article on the Facebook page for News from Neptune, I suggest it's the best short summary of the recent political exercise.
So let me just mention, there's some videos on the web that are not on YouTube that are worth mentioning for good and bad reasons. One is on the New York Times website called Operation Infection. For some reason, infection is spelled Infektion, and the subtitle of this series of 15-minute movies, 3 parts, about 45 minutes worth, the subtitle is Russian Disinformation from the Cold War to Kanye. And I only mention this, just check it out for yourself and see how bad it is, see how propagandistic this is, how lurid this is, in the assumption that somehow Russia is undermining our democratic processes. It's of course slickly done, but it's to anybody with any critical processes, there are all of the questions that one might ask of a good piece of propaganda. It is a piece of propaganda. Not a piece of propaganda are 2 other films or sets of films. One, it is called The Lobby, and it's available on the Electronic Intifada website. It's called The Lobby USA. It was produced by Al Jazeera and suppressed by the Qatari government for reasons of whatever those pressures are, but it was somehow obtained by Electronic Intifada, which is obviously a pro-Palestinian website. And this is in 4 parts, about 45 minutes each part, so it's quite lengthy. I didn't watch the whole thing, but it is a very well done piece of journalism, of sort of undercover journalism, in which a young man presents himself as wanting to work with those people in this country who transmit, who are part of the Israeli operations to discredit pro-Palestinian groups in this country, including student groups. I wouldn't say that I learned a lot from what I watched of these. It's very well done. I already knew a lot of this, but in case you don't know a lot of this, if you don't have any idea of how brazen Israel is, as opposed to Russia per se. I mean, when you compare Israel to Russia, there's no comparison in what the effect it actually has on American political processes. Although, as we always mention on this show, I don't want to overestimate the power of the Israel lobby on our allegedly democratic processes. The other film is on its own website, but it's available. There's condensed versions and the complete version of the movie, the hour and 20-minute movie, I think it is, Occupation of the American Mind, narrated by Roger Waters, of Pink Floyd fame. Mm-hmm. I have not watched this movie yet, but again, I don't expect to learn that much from it that I don't already know. It seems like a more conventional overview of the manner in which both the Israel lobby and AIPAC and Israel itself working together influence our perceptions of what's going on in that region. So those are 3 things. I don't know. Maybe you wanted to segue into referring to the Netanyahu-Lieberman shenanigans of this week, or did you? Is that
worth talking about?
I would only,
no.
Maybe not. But I would just, if anybody wants to spend 10 minutes learning about that, I would, as always, recommend the interview with Shir Hever on the Real News Network. He's a guy who knows what's going on and understands Israel's internal politics and why Netanyahu is having the problems that he does. What Lieberman's, this is Avigdor, not Joseph, Avigdor Lieberman. We got to keep our Lieberman straight here, and what.
Ach du Lieber.
And obviously, it's a serious issue because it led to people getting killed in Gaza. It led to the possibility of a renewed war in Gaza. So this is a serious issue, but primarily it's an issue about internal Israeli politics, between Netanyahu and Lieberman.
I thought one of the most interesting, interesting is not right, one of the more amusing aspects of this recent imbroglio, if there could be anything at all amusing about it, was Netanyahu running around Paris for the 100-year celebration of the end of World War I, desperately trying to sit down with Vladimir Putin. The Russians have a legitimate grievance, or new recent grievance against the Israelis, in that they say, with some justice, that the Israelis are responsible for Syria shooting down a Russian plane and in Syria with a loss of 15 Russian lives. This was a complex and desperate maneuver on the part of Syria and Israel, and the victims were Russians. So the attempt by the Israeli Prime Minister to make nice with Vladimir Putin became a Keystone Cops routine in Paris, where the Israelis kept insisting that they were going to have a conversation with Putin, and the Russians kept insisting that they weren't. And they ended up with a casual conversation in an emptying dining hall as Netanyahu and Putin indeed talked about various matters because of the very real concerns that the Russians have about keeping Israel indeed out of the Syrian imbroglio, and apparently the effectiveness of the Russians in doing so. So the local Israeli politics are bound up with the ongoing Syrian arrangement in which Russia seems, for the moment at least, to have the upper hand. And that is probably good in terms of preventing the continuing massive loss of life in Syria that the United States is finally responsible for. But yes, we shall see, and we shall see what the peculiar twist in this was the extent to which Netanyahu's domestic politics means that, surprisingly enough, he is less aggressive on this matter than other elements within the Israeli political establishment, and that occasioned surprise in some quarters this week. The companies that make jets, bombs, and aircraft carriers for the U.S. military are telling investors that the defense business still will be booming under a Democrat-controlled House of Representatives. The reason, one defense executive said, that is given that the Democrats will control the House of Representatives in the new Congress, the suggestion is that the Republican support for the defense industry might be lessened. Not to worry, they say. The reason, one defense executive said, is that the Democratic takeover of the House could weaken Republican deficit hawks in Congress at a time when their influence is already diminished. The argument is a battle by night in a lot of ways. The notion that less will be spent on military procurement, less will go to defense contractors because the Republicans are deficit hawks, is a pretty weak argument to begin with. But nevertheless, the defense contractors themselves say not to worry. Our friends, the Democrats in the House, will make sure that the money keeps flowing to us. One concern that we did have was relative to deficit hawks. Raytheon is a major weapons maker, Chief Executive Thomas Kennedy said at a conference in Chicago this week. It turns out that most of the deficit hawks were in the House and on the Republican side. He went on to say the Democratic takeover changes the equation relative to conversations around the national debt. The environment is actually nice now because it's settled. We know exactly what it is, Kennedy said. The uncertainty has been taken out, and we know that we don't have this issue with the deficit hawks moving forward, so we're actually very, very optimistic. This is from the the chairman of one of the leading defense contractors, weapons makers in the country, and those people who told us, well, of course, the Democrats are an anti-war party, and the Democrats will do good things for American war making. We'll pull it back if they're given control of the House. Couldn't be more wrong, as was clear long before the election. But now the defense contractors, the weapons makers themselves make it clear. It's astonishing.
Yeah, just two little notes as we move forward here. As usual, some references to the Counterpunch website and some of their Friday columnists. Rob Urie, U-R-I-E, and his comments on the Amazon deals, I think, are as good a place as any to find a thorough critique of what that's all about, previously referred to in your Virginia, Northern Virginia childhood notes. And also Jeffrey St. Clair, not to neglect the fires in California, but I think Jeffrey St. Clair's comments on that, they're a good place to start. I don't know if we want to get into that, but it's obviously a big topic. But Jeffrey, as always, does a good job of putting forward some pithy comments about the sort of environmental context in which these fires are obviously taking place, the global warming context in which these fires are taking place, both in Northern California and Southern California.
Jeffrey Sinclair, the editor of Counterpunch and a friend to this ground, has a new book, The Big Heat,
Right.
About these issues. And as the column that David was just mentioning appears on the Counterpunch website today under the title Roaming Charges, in which Jeffrey, probably the leading environmental writer in the country, talks about the awful California fires and how that's bound up not only with the general questions of climate catastrophe, but also with the general question of American government policy on these and related matters, and we recommend it highly. We have a couple of minutes left.
He noted that San Francisco, as a few days ago, had the worst air quality of any city in the world on that particular day because of those fires. Obviously, that's not customary. All the other cities listed are in India, Pakistan, and those kinds of places. But these fires shot San Francisco's air quality ahead of, in a worse way, than any of those other more chronically polluted cities.
Let's see, of the things that are left, what can we pull out?
I would just refer to also, on this morning's Counterpunch website, David Swanson's column.
Oh, okay.
He wrote a column that had to do with the former Marine who killed a lot of people in Thousand Oaks in the day before the fire started in that same region, and I think his comments are very apropos. They're a little too lengthy to read in the time that we have left, but I would encourage anyone to read them in terms of relating the relationship between military veterans and killing people when they get home and suicide and so forth. Obviously not a very light topic, but again, one that was somehow compartmentalized in the context of Veterans Day. We weren't really talking about what happens, and that of course isn't to condemn or paint with a broad brush. It's just to talk about the risks of sending people, mostly men obviously, to war, teaching them how to kill people, teaching them how to use weapons, and then what happens to them when they come home.
Perhaps we'll finish with the poem that David mentioned at the top of the hour. That is the poem written by a young employee of Foxconn, this Taiwanese supplier for Apple. The conditions under which these suppliers employ labor are horrific and have been described as such. This poem was written by a young man called Zhu Liji, who killed himself at the age of 24 while working in this Apple supplier, Foxconn. The poem is called, and as I say, this is not my translation, I fall asleep just standing like that. The paper before my eyes fades yellow. With a steel pin I chisel on it uneven black, full of working words. Workshop, assembly line, machine, work card, overtime, wages. They've trained me to become docile. Don't know how to shout or rebel, how to complain or denounce, only how to silently suffer exhaustion. When I first set foot in this place, I hoped only for that gray pay slip on the 10th of each month to grant me some belated solace. For this I had to grind away my corners, grind away my words, refuse to skip work, refuse sick leave, refuse leave for private reasons, refuse to be late, refuse to leave early. By the assembly line I stood straight like iron, hands like flight. For how many days, how many nights did I, just like that, standing, fall asleep? The date is August 2011, and the young man killed himself in 2014. You've been watching News from Neptune, presented by David Green and Carl Estabrook, with research by J.B. Nicholson. It's produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Ethan Young and Andrew Scholarly. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere in The Tempest, what's past is prologue, what to come and yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies and a good night to you.